There are moments when the quiet between two people feels louder than any argument. Maybe you've been there, sitting alone with your thoughts, replaying every detail of your last conversation, searching for clues in the spaces where words used to live. When he stopped answering, when his presence started to fade like the last trace of sunlight before night takes over, you felt something tighten in your chest, a heaviness that made you wonder if you were too much, or perhaps not enough. You asked yourself, again and again, if his silence was proof that you had loved too deeply, offered too much of yourself, or simply believed in something he was never ready to hold. And yet, somewhere beneath the ache, a small voice whispered that maybe his withdrawal was never really about your worth. Maybe it was about the feelings he didn't know how to name. Louise once said, "We are each responsible for all of our experiences." It's a truth that sounds simple until you're left alone, trying to carry both your pain and someone else's confusion. Because sometimes, a man who feels more than he can bear will slip away, not because you failed, but because he doesn't trust his own heart to stay. His silence isn't always a rejection. It's often a shield, a way to avoid the depth that terrifies him. You might be wondering why he could share laughter and warmth, why he could look into your eyes and speak about forever, only to vanish when things became too real. But the heart is an unpredictable landscape, and not everyone has learned how to stand in the truth of their own longing. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes from loving someone who seems awake, who seems to see you, who seems to want you, and yet disappears when the intimacy becomes undeniable. You feel the sting of it in your body, in the hollow of your stomach, in the restless hours of the night. It's a wound that echoes with old stories, the ones that told you love has to be earned or proven or performed. When he went silent, all those stories rushed back, flooding your mind with questions that have no clear answers. You told yourself that if you could just understand, you could fix it. If you could just say the right thing, he would come back, willing to stand in the light with you. But perhaps there is another possibility. Perhaps the depth you offered him was never the problem. Perhaps it was the mirror you held up to his soul, the reflection he wasn't prepared to face. Brené Brown teaches that vulnerability can feel like exposure, like standing naked in a place where you don't know if you'll be accepted or judged. For some men, that kind of exposure is unbearable. Not because you were too much, but because your presence illuminated parts of them that have been hidden, even from themselves. And so, when you start to believe that his distance is proof you should shrink, or soften, or hide your own heart, I invite you to pause, to feel, really feel, how much of this is yours to carry. How much of this is his to heal? Because love doesn't always leave clean edges. Sometimes, it leaves us in the quiet, holding our own hands, learning that even the deepest silence can't erase the truth of who we are. But what happens when the longing for answers becomes a cage you build around your own spirit? There is a hidden overwhelm that he may never confess, a quiet storm inside him that has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with his fear of feeling too much. You might have noticed how his eyes would soften in those unguarded moments, how his voice would catch when he tried to explain the way he felt drawn to you. And then, almost as quickly, he would retreat, leaving you with 1,000 unanswered questions. It's as if the intensity you shared pressed against something fragile in him, something he spent years trying to protect. When the connection between two souls grows too honest, it can unearth old wounds that were carefully buried beneath layers of distraction and denial. Sometimes, what feels like rejection is simply a man stepping back because he is terrified of losing control over the story he tells himself. The story that says he is strong because he never lets anyone too close. The story that says needing someone is the same as weakness. He might have learned this long before he met you, maybe from a father who never spoke of his own fears, or from a culture that told him that men must be unshakable, always certain, never vulnerable. And so when he looks into your eyes and feels something he can't contain, he disappears, convinced that disappearing will save him from the shame of admitting how much he cares. But you feel it, don't you? That ache beneath his silence. The way the energy between you shifts, even when no words are spoken. It's a peculiar kind of grief, to stand at the edge of a connection so powerful, only to watch him shrink away from it. You start to wonder if you should have hidden more of your tenderness, if your willingness to love so fully was somehow the thing that broke him open. And in that wondering, the seed of self-blame takes root. Yet the truth is simpler, even if it hurts to accept. His silence might be the only way he knows to hold himself together when the feelings rise like a tide he cannot resist. The quiet is his attempt to stay in control, to keep from admitting that your presence stirs something he can neither predict nor manage. And so he steps back. He hides behind half-finished messages and unreturned calls. He tells himself that the distance will make it easier, that if he can just avoid your light, he won't have to see the parts of himself that long for more. It's not your job to dismantle his fear. It's not your purpose to hold yourself smaller so he can feel bigger. What you offered him, truth, tenderness, and depth, was never a burden. It was a gift he wasn't ready to hold. And maybe you feel it now, the beginnings of a quiet understanding that his retreat was never truly about you. But what happens when the pattern repeats itself? When the silence becomes a familiar echo you keep interpreting as something you did wrong? When the pattern of avoidance begins to circle you like a quiet shadow, it becomes easy to believe that it must be your fault. You replay every detail, every sentence you spoke, searching for evidence that you were too eager, too vulnerable, too honest. It's almost instinctive to assume that if someone withdraws, it must be because you overstepped some invisible line, and so you shrink yourself, holding your breath around your own longing, afraid that any sign of desire or hope will be used as proof that you were too much. There is a moment, though, when you begin to see how familiar this feeling has become, the ache of waiting for someone to return, the hollow space where your worth used to be. It feels almost like a memory you keep reliving, though you can't quite place when it started. Perhaps it began long before him, back when you first learned that love was something you had to earn by staying quiet, by staying small, by not needing too much. You might have carried that lesson into every connection, believing that if you could just be perfect enough, patient enough, understanding enough, no one would ever leave again. Louise Hay spoke to this with a clarity that cuts through the fog of self-blame. I am not responsible for how others choose to feel or act. There is such freedom in these words, though at first, they can feel almost too simple to be true. Because when you love someone with your whole being, it's hard to accept that their silence isn't yours to fix, that no amount of softness or sacrifice can heal what they refuse to face inside themselves. It's tempting to believe that if you can only prove how steady you are, how willing you are to wait, you'll finally earn the reassurance you crave. But what if the reassurance you need is the one you can only give yourself? What if it's not your responsibility to carry both your heart and his fear of intimacy? This is the quiet reckoning that comes after the tears have dried and the questions have exhausted you. It's the realization that someone else's inability to stay has nothing to do with your capacity to be loved. His pattern of disappearing is a reflection of his own unfinished work, his own unhealed stories. And you, who have loved with such tenderness, are not to blame for the spaces he refuses to fill. But what happens when he does feel more than he can hold, and the weight of that intensity becomes something he can no longer pretend isn't there? When he feels more than he can hold, there is a subtle shift in the way he looks at you. You might notice it in the softness of his eyes when he lets his guard down, in the moments when his hand lingers against yours, as if he's searching for something he doesn't know how to name. Those fleeting instants can feel so real, so undeniable, that you almost believe this time will be different. But then, as quickly as the tenderness appeared, it disappears behind the walls he built long before he ever met you. It can be confusing, even painful, to watch someone pull away precisely because what they feel is too big, too bright, too consuming. It doesn't look like rejection in the traditional sense. It looks like someone standing too close to the sun, drawn to its warmth, but terrified of being burned. You can feel the tension between his desire and his fear, the way he both reaches for you and recoils at the same time. It's the dance of someone who has spent their life believing that needing love is dangerous, that surrendering to feeling is a kind of death. There is nothing rational about this response. You could list all the reasons he should trust you, all the evidence that you are safe, that you are patient, that you are willing to meet him where he is. But the mind is rarely what flees when intimacy becomes too real. It's the heart, the deeper self that carries every old story of disappointment, every hidden wound of not being enough. And when the heart begins to remember those stories, the instinct is to run. Not because you've done something wrong, but because the mirror you hold up to him is too honest to bear. It's important to understand that his confusion does not have to become your confusion. His fear does not have to become your burden. You can witness his struggle without making it a reflection of your value. You can stand in the knowing that some people will always mistake deep feeling for threat, not because you are too much, but because they have never learned how to stay with their own vulnerability. And still, even with this understanding, it doesn't take away the sting of watching someone slip through your fingers. It doesn't erase the loneliness that follows. But perhaps there is a different way to see this pattern. Not as evidence that you are unworthy, but as proof of how powerful your presence really is. That you are the kind of woman whose love cannot be held lightly, whose truth cannot be touched without awakening something deeper. But what happens when his silence collides with the old wounds you carry, the ones that whisper you are destined to be abandoned again? When his silence presses against your old abandonment wounds, it can feel like the past is happening all over again. It's as if every unanswered message, every moment of emptiness between you, reaches back in time and reawakens the girl inside you who waited by the phone, who wondered if she was easy to leave. You feel it in your chest, in that familiar ache that makes it hard to breathe. You feel it in the hollow space where certainty should be, in the way you start questioning everything about yourself. Piece by fragile piece. There is a quiet cruelty in this kind of waiting. Not because he intends to hurt you, but because his absence becomes the canvas onto which you project every fear you've ever carried. The fear that you are not enough. The fear that love will always slip away just when you start to trust it. The fear that your softness is a liability you should have learned to hide by now. And yet, in the midst of this ache, there is a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. His silence is not proof of your inadequacy. It is simply an echo of his own unfinished story. Louise Hay spoke of this with such gentle certainty. She reminded us that no one else can define our worth, no matter how convincing their absence might feel. When you repeat to yourself, "I am whole and lovable even when others withdraw," you begin to loosen the grip of those old narratives. You begin to remember that the story you inherited, the one that says you must earn love by never needing too much, was never really yours to carry. This is not an easy knowing. It requires you to sit in the emptiness without rushing to fill it. It requires you to feel the sorrow of wanting someone who cannot meet you, without making that longing a verdict against your heart. And when you can do that, even for a moment, something begins to shift. The pain doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. You start to see his retreat not as a reflection of your unworthiness, but as a sign of where he is in his own healing. And perhaps, as you hold this awareness, you will notice that the ache softens just enough to let you breathe again, that the silence loses some of its power to define you, because there is a difference between being abandoned and being left to remember your own value. One is a wound that can fester. The other is an invitation to stand more fully in the truth of who you are. But what happens when you begin to understand that his distance is rooted not only in fear of you, but in a deeper fear of losing himself? When you start to look beyond the surface of his silence, you may begin to sense that what he fears most isn't you at all. It is the possibility that in loving you, he will have to surrender parts of himself he has spent a lifetime protecting. There is a hidden dread in some hearts, a quiet terror of dissolving into the intensity of connection, of losing the fragile boundaries that hold a man's identity together. And so he keeps his distance, not because you have asked too much, but because he believes that being fully seen will somehow erase him. You might have glimpsed this fear in the way he looked at you when the tenderness grew too bright to deny, in the way his voice would falter when he tried to put words around the enormity of what he felt, in the way he would draw close for a moment, almost as if he was ready to trust you, only to retreat again behind a polite distance. It is a cycle as old as his own unspoken wounds, this longing to be known, and the terror of being swallowed by that knowing. There was a woman who once loved a man whose silence felt like punishment. She spent years believing that if she could only prove her devotion, he would finally stay. But what she discovered, slowly and painfully, was that his absence had never been about her. It had always been about the stories he told himself when he was alone. Stories that whispered love would cost him his freedom, that closeness would unravel his sense of self, and so he chose the safety of distance over the risk of surrender. Perhaps you have known this same confusion, the disorienting reality that someone can feel so much for you and still turn away. It is a peculiar kind of heartbreak to realize that love is not always enough to make someone brave, that even when your heart is open, even when you are ready to meet them with understanding, they can still choose to hide. but there is a tender clarity in seeing the truth without flinching. His fear of dissolving is his burden to explore. It is not your responsibility to prove that loving you will not destroy him. You are not the architect of his courage. You are not the keeper of his healing. You are simply the mirror in which he glimpsed his own vulnerability. And for some, that is too much to bear. And as you stand in this knowing, you may begin to see that the quiet between you is not emptiness at all. It is space. Space to decide what you are willing to hold, what you are willing to forgive, and what you are no longer willing to sacrifice just to be chosen. But what happens when he convinces himself that disappearing is the only way to feel in control? When he convinces himself that disappearing is the only way to feel in control, something subtle shifts in the dynamic between you. The man who once shared laughter and secrets with you begins to shrink into a version of himself you can barely recognize. He believes that stepping back will protect him from the intensity he isn't ready to name. He tells himself that if he can stay hidden behind polite distance, he won't have to feel the vulnerability that your presence awakens. It is an illusion of safety that costs both of you something precious. This is the story he never says aloud, the quiet narrative he repeats in his own mind. That silence will keep him strong. That disappearing will make it easier to forget. But the truth is, the act of withdrawing doesn't bring relief. It only deepens the loneliness he tries so hard to outrun. You can see it in the way his eyes flicker when you cross his thoughts. You can sense it in the pause before he responds to your messages, the hesitation that says he's still tangled in what he feels. It is almost tender, this illusion he clings to, like a turtle retracting into its shell, not because you are dangerous, but because he is unprepared to stand in the light of his own longing. He wants to believe that closing himself off will make him less vulnerable, that if he can stay hidden long enough, the feelings will fade. But love is not so easily silenced. What he doesn't understand is that disappearing does not make him invincible. It simply postpones the reckoning he will have to face, whether he is with you or alone. For you, the ache of watching this unfold is its own quiet grief. You know that the absence is not about your worth. You know in some deeper place that you did not cause this. But still, it hurts to be on the receiving end of someone else's fear. It hurts to be the one who holds space while they run from their own tenderness. And it hurts to realize that no amount of love can make them ready before they choose to be. Yet even in this, there is a kind of clarity waiting for you. His need to disappear is not your invitation to chase him. His retreat is not your cue to prove that you are worthy of staying. You are allowed to stand still while he wrestles with himself. You are allowed to remain rooted in the truth of your own heart, even when his has gone quiet. But what happens when you decide to stop reaching for answers he cannot give, and instead, turn your energy toward the quiet sanctuary inside yourself? When you decide to stop reaching for answers he cannot give, something begins to soften inside you. The restless searching quiets. The questions lose their sharp edges. It doesn't mean you stop caring, or that you suddenly feel nothing. It means you have chosen to stop carrying the burden of proving your worth to someone who isn't ready to see it, and in that decision, there is a kind of quiet power that can feel almost foreign at first. There is a moment when you realize that your energy has been orbiting his confusion, that you have been pouring yourself into a space that could never reflect back the clarity you deserve. It can be unsettling to withdraw that energy, to stop rehearsing the conversations in your mind, to stop checking for signs that he might come back ready to meet you. But with every breath you reclaim, you begin to remember that your life is not measured by how close someone stands beside you. It is measured by how deeply you are willing to stand with yourself. It is here, in this space of intentional stillness, that a new kind of ritual begins. You start to choose small acts of care that are not designed to make him notice you, but to remind yourself that you are worthy of tenderness even in his absence. You find comfort in the simplest gestures: a morning walk, a cup of tea held between your hands, a moment of silence where you can feel your own heart beating, without the urgency of waiting for his. These are not distractions. They are invitations to return to yourself, to gather the pieces of your spirit that were scattered in the longing. You may notice that the more you tend to your own wholeness, the less power his silence has to wound you. What once felt like an echo of rejection becomes simply a reflection of where he is, and where you no longer wish to follow. There is something profound that happens when you stop chasing clarity from someone who cannot offer it. You become the keeper of your own peace. You become the witness to your own worth. And in this quiet reclaiming, you begin to see that love is never meant to be proven by how persistently you wait in someone else's shadow. Love, the kind that nourishes and expands you, begins within. It grows in the spaces where you refuse to abandon yourself. But what happens when you choose to stand in your own silence, and he finally feels the emptiness he created? When you choose to stand in your own silence, something shifts on the other side of the quiet. The space you once filled with questions and longing becomes an absence he can no longer ignore. Sometimes, it is only in the stillness of your own peace that he feels the weight of the emptiness he has created. Your silence is not surrender. It is a powerful lesson wrapped in patience and self-respect. You might notice that for the first time, his retreat no longer invites panic or desperation within you. Instead, it asks him to reckon with the distance he's built, the walls he's raised to keep himself safe. It's as if your refusal to chase after explanations becomes a mirror that reflects his own discomfort with being left alone with his feelings. Sometimes the greatest teaching happens not in spoken words, but in the quiet presence of someone who refuses to lose themselves in waiting. Louise reminds us, "I choose peace over drama." This is the peace you embody when you stop trying to make sense of his silence, and instead choose to sit gently with your own heart. It's a peace that doesn't depend on his return or his understanding. It is a peace born from knowing your worth, your completeness, and your power to heal within yourself. In that silence, the possibility of transformation begins to bloom, not because he suddenly understands, but because you have created a space where your spirit can breathe freely. You no longer carry the weight of his fears or his inability to stay present. Instead, you carry the quiet strength of a woman who has learned that sometimes the most profound love is the love you give yourself when no one else will. And as this transformation takes root, a new question rises gently in your soul. Does he deserve a place in the life you are now creating? As this quiet transformation unfolds, the question becomes inevitable. Does he deserve a place in the life you are now creating? It's a tender but firm inquiry that asks you to look beyond longing and past pain to the deeper truth of your own worth. You are no longer the woman waiting in the shadows of his absence. You are the woman who knows that love, at its core, is about mutual presence, respect, and emotional courage. There is a clarity that comes when you stop making excuses for someone else's inability to show up fully. When you recognize that maturity in love is not just about feeling deeply, but about being willing to stay even when it's hard. It's about choosing to meet vulnerability with openness rather than fleeing from it. And if he cannot offer this, no matter how much you desire him to, you are free to honor your own needs and boundaries without guilt or shame. Imagine love not as a fire you tend alone, but as a fire meant to be shared, a fire that warms both bodies and spirits, that invites companionship rather than isolation. It is not your responsibility to keep a fire burning when the other has stepped away. Your role is to nurture your own flame, steady, bright, and alive with the wisdom that comes from surviving the storms. There is power in this discernment, power in choosing yourself when love becomes a one-sided endeavor, power in standing tall with the knowledge that your heart is sacred and it deserves to be held with reverence. And while it is natural to grieve what might have been, there is also freedom in knowing you no longer have to carry the weight of someone else's silence. Louise Hay's words echo here like a gentle balm. I am willing to let go of the need to be unworthy. In releasing that need, you reclaim your space in the world, whole, worthy, and ready to love on your own terms. As we come to the close of this reflection, I invite you to hold this truth close. Your value does not depend on his courage to love with presence. Your worth is constant, steady, and unshakable, regardless of how others choose to show up. If this message has touched your heart, I encourage you to subscribe and continue walking this path of healing and empowerment with us. There are more stories, more reflections, and more gentle guidance waiting for you. Click on the video that appears on your screen to keep exploring the journey toward your own freedom and self-love.